We've always been told that curses and dark sorcery belong only to the flickering frames of Hollywood horror films, myths designed to scare, not to be believed. But beneath the blinding glare of fame, where brilliance is carefully crafted to conceal decay, the most brutal curses have taken human form. We see it in the blood-sealed bargain of a blues prodigy at a lonely crossroads, surrendering his soul for supernatural mastery of the strings. We see it in the slow, agonizing punishment etched into the very identity of a pop legend, the crushing cost of sitting atop a throne of porcelain and gold. And we see it in the grim fate of a prince of soul who dared to steal the sacred breath of God from the church, transforming it into songs of earthly desire, only to be silenced by his own father's hand. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain and exhume the most chilling secrets in entertainment history. We journey into the haunted legacies of 13 black icons bound by the world's most horrifying curses, where every rise to greatness was, in truth, a signed death warrant, and the blood-soaked price of eternal glory was never meant to be survived. Sam Cooke, the king brought down in the shadows of Hacienda. He was the true architect of soul, a man whose voice flowed like velvet and whose will was forged from iron. By the early 1960s, he did what few black artists had ever dared to do. He stopped begging for a seat at the table and built one of his own. With SAR Records, Sam claimed ownership of his music, his image, and his future. But deep within the industry's ivory towers, the men he defied, the gatekeepers who fed on the talent of black artists, were already plotting his punishment. If Sam would not serve, then Sam would be made an example. The rebellion didn't begin on the streets, but in smoke-filled boardrooms in Los Angeles and New York. In response to his independence, a quiet war was unleashed, one fought not with contracts, but with shadows. Whispers tell of a single silk button stolen from one of Sam's custom suits, a fragment of his essence delivered to a root doctor to bind a gutter curse. This curse was never meant to silence his voice. His voice was still too valuable. Instead, it was designed to erode his dignity, to weigh on his spirit like a stone, slowly pulling him away from the bright ballrooms and the heart of the movement, dragging him toward the neon grime of the underworld. Gradually, the polish that defined Sam began to crack. His judgment dulled. An unexplainable hunger drew him into dangerous corners of Los Angeles, toward people who meant him no good. By December 11, 1964, the descent reached its brutal end at the Hacienda Motel, a $3 a night dive worlds away from the velvet life he had earned. Drawn there by a mysterious woman and clouded by a spiritual fog, Sam stumbled into a frantic confrontation with the motel manager, a woman who would become the curse's final, cold instrument. In the blood-slicked office of that motel, the gutter curse reached its climax. 3 gunshots ended the life of a king. But the true horror was how he was left. The man who taught a generation of black Americans to stand tall was found collapsed on a filthy floor, wearing only a sports coat and a single shoe. His body was stripped, his dignity erased, his majesty deliberately humiliated, a final, calculated warning to anyone bold enough to try to own their destiny. Marvin Gaye, the final psalm sung inside a broken house of God. On April 1, 1984, music itself seemed to die at 21101 South Gramercy Place. Just one day before his 45th birthday, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his own father. The courts called it manslaughter, but to the elders it was a brutal settling of accounts, a circle closing on a son who dared to leave the altar for the stage. The shadow was born in the church, where Marvin's father, a fire and brimstone preacher, taught that the human voice belonged solely to the Lord. In that doctrine, Marvin's use of his sanctified vibrato to sing of flesh and longing in songs like sexual healing was seen as the ultimate betrayal. He had taken God's breath and turned it toward earthly desire, stripping himself of spiritual protection and laying bare the darkness that festered within his fractured home. On Christmas Day, Marvin gave his father a Smith & Wesson .38 special, an act that, in the old traditions, was an invitation for death itself to step inside. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, a trivial argument ignited decades of buried rage. The Reverend pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through Marvin's heart, the same heart that powered his legendary voice and carried his deepest pain. Standing over his dying son, The father delivered a final, chilling decree: "I brought you into this world, and I'll take you out." Marvin Gaye's blood became the last offering. In the end, the weight of the pulpit crushed the man who tried to turn its holy fire into gold. Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson, the covenant of the altered form. By the dawn of the 1980s, Michael Jackson stood at a spiritual crossroads. To rise from a Motown child prodigy into a global deity, he was said to have sought a force beyond charts and contracts. Rumors speak of a secret pilgrimage to the West Indies, a place steeped in ancient, unspoken rituals, where he allegedly entered a chilling pact. In exchange for an eternal crown as the king of pop, the cost would be his physical self. He would never truly age. Instead, he would become something otherworldly, an apparition belonging to the stage, not to mankind. The first cut of this unseen covenant came in 1984, during the infamous Pepsi commercial fire. To the initiated, it was no accident but a ceremonial opening, the moment the physical world loosened its grip on him. What medicine would later name vitiligo, and surgery would call refinement, the spiritual realm interpreted as erasure, a gradual biological fading. Each procedure pulled him further from his origins, reshaping him into a porcelain figure, immaculate, luminous, and deeply unsettling. To gain the world, he shed the very skin that tethered him to his people, becoming a man without a reflection he could truly recognize. The debt deepened in 1985 when Michael acquired the Beatles' catalog, a bold act of financial rebellion against the industry's pharaohs. From that moment on, the storms intensified. The legal catastrophes of 1993 and 2005 were no longer seen by believers as trials, but as public exorcisms, rituals meant to siphon the life force he had once bartered away. The more he fortified Neverland, the more the world seemed to circle, feeding on what remained of his essence. The final reckoning arrived in June 2009, just 48 hours before his triumphant return in London. By then, Michael was a shadow of flesh, relying on propofol as a spiritual sedative to silence the voices demanding payment. On June 25th, alone and isolated, he took his final breath. His eyes were said to be wide open, a haunting sign that he had finally seen the collectors arrive, coming to claim what was left of a man who had stopped belonging to himself long before his heart did. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway, the covenant in the copper wires. He possessed a voice that felt less like sound and more like revelation, a divine transmission capable of turning heartbreak into harmony. In 1971, inside the crumbling confines of Studio Zero in Harlem, whispers claim he encountered an engineer who was more occultist than technician. There, Donny is said to have struck a fateful bargain, a celestial frequency, flawless pitch that would shake the world, in exchange for terrifying access to his own mind. He became a master of melody, unaware that he had transformed his psyche into a receiver for something not meant for this realm. By the mid-1970s, the quiet within Donny's soul gave way to a relentless internal roar. What doctors diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia, the spiritual lens saw as a contract coming due. He grew fixated on the machinery of his fame, often spotted at Atlantic Records, feverishly dismantling microphones and amplifiers. He wasn't searching for bugs. He believed the copper wires in the walls were living conduits, golden veins through which a parasitic force was draining his life essence. Every electronic device became a mechanical mouth, a debt collector of the abyss, feeding on his genius. The haunting reached its chilling climax on January 13, 1979, inside room 1508 of the Essex House Hotel. Investigators were left quietly shaken. The 15th floor window hadn't been shattered in chaos. It had been carefully dismantled from the inside, glass and frame laid neatly on the carpet like the work of a trained craftsman. There was no struggle, no disorder, no note. Donny had traded his inner peace for a crown of thorns, leaving behind the echo of a man who learned too late that when you gamble with your mind, the house always comes to collect. Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston, the thief of secrets, the woman fate tried to erase. She was the blazing soul of the Harlem Renaissance, all fire and brilliance, too wild to be contained by New York's polite salons. In 1936, drawn by the hypnotic drumbeat of the Caribbean, She disappeared into the mist-soaked mountains of Haiti and Jamaica. She didn't merely observe the culture, she penetrated its most guarded mysteries. Rumors whispered that she knelt before the lowest spirits, offering her own blood in exchange for knowledge of the living dead. Initiated into sacred rites, she became a keeper of forbidden truths, swearing the revelations she witnessed would remain forever sealed within her soul. But Zora was a storyteller, and temptation was her oldest companion. In 1938, she broke her vow with Tell My Horse, a book that read like a dangerous confession. She named the spirits. She revealed the rituals. She even published the chilling photograph of a woman said to have been pulled back from the grave, an unforgivable trespass to the high priests of the islands. Zora hadn't simply written a book, she had stolen the breath of the gods and breathed it into her prose. The spirits, legend says, answered with punishment. A veil of crossing fell over her life, a curse meant to dim her brilliance until she vanished. In 1948, at the height of her power, a devastating false scandal ripped through her world, staining her name overnight. Though innocent, she was left frozen out. Publishers fell silent. Friends evaporated. Admirers turned into phantoms. The flow that once made her unstoppable dried up, transforming the queen of the Renaissance into a wanderer haunting the edges of her own legacy. By 1960, the woman who once outshone the Manhattan skyline was working as a maid in Florida. Hands that had held the secrets of gods now scrubbed the floors of strangers. She died in quiet isolation and was buried in an unmarked, weed-choked grave. For 13 years, the world forgot her name, the ultimate price for a woman who dared to bargain with the divine and then tell their stories. It took a kindred spirit, Alice Walker, to find that lonely patch of earth in 1973 and perform the act of remembrance that finally called Zora Neale Hurston back from silence. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor, the failed fire of purification. He was born into darkness, raised inside a Peoria brothel where violence, addiction, and abuse were not visitors but constant companions. Those early ghosts never loosened their grip. Pryor spent his life outrunning them, transmuting pain into comedy, brilliance into survival, until cocaine became his final refuge, a volatile shortcut to power over memories that refused to stay buried. On the night of June 9, 1980, Pryor crossed a line few ever returned from. In an act many spiritualists later described as a doomed purification ritual, he tried to destroy his inner demons with literal fire. He doused himself in rum, struck a match, and turned his Northridge home into an altar of hellfire. At first, he laughed it off, telling reporters the blaze was just the sun coming to get me. But time loosened the truth. In later interviews, Pryor admitted it wasn't a drug-fueled accident, it was intentional. While burning, he said he felt a horrifying calm, a moment of peace, as if the flames were finally scrubbing his soul clean. The spiritual community saw it differently. Earthly fire, they warned, cannot cleanse the abyss. It only summons a greater debt. Pryor hadn't erased his demons. He had branded himself with what some called the negative fire. The reckoning arrived in 1986 with a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. In cruel, ritualistic irony, the man who once ran through the streets as a human torch was now being frozen from the inside out. Conspiracy theorists whispered that the curse had simply changed shape. Unable to burn his demons away, Pryor's own nervous system became their battleground. The disease stripped him piece by piece, his lightning-fast movement, his thunderous voice, until he was trapped inside his own body, a silent prisoner for nearly 20 years. The final summons came on December 10, 2005, when Pryor suffered a massive heart attack. Yet those at his bedside said the true horror was in his eyes. In his last moments, his gaze locked onto the empty corners of the room, wide with terror, as if bargaining with unseen collectors come to claim an overdue debt. Richard Pryor died realizing the fire he lit in 1980 hadn't failed. It had simply waited 25 long years to finish consuming the man who dared to play with the devil's matches. Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday, the dark alchemy of Lady Day. She didn't just sing the blues, she ripped open the veil between worlds. In 1939, on the stage of New York's Café Society, she introduced Strange Fruit, a song that felt less like music and more like an invocation. The room would fall into complete darkness, except for one unforgiving spotlight fixed on her unsmiling face. And in that stillness, she called something forth. Whispers spread through Harlem like folklore. By chanting the South's unspeakable horrors night after night, Billy was awakening the unavenged dead, dragging them up from red clay soil to stand silently in the shadows beside her. Strange Fruit, with its brutal images of lynched bodies swaying from southern trees, became a spiritual summons. Elders believed every performance pulled more restless souls into the room, surrounding her, listening through her. That act of calling the dead drew a predator. Harry Anslinger, the ruthless head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, emerged like a white devil from the streets. He hunted Billy with obsessive fury. He didn't merely plant drugs. He carried out a slow spiritual execution. By stripping her of her cabaret card, he starved her livelihood, cut her off from stages, and isolated her from the living. His goal was simple: bury her voice while she was still breathing. The haunting reached its cruel climax in the summer of 1959. As Billy lay dying of heart failure in Metropolitan Hospital, federal agents delivered one final act of desecration, handcuffing her frail wrists to the bed rails. Nurses later whispered that she murmured to unseen figures lurking in the corners of the room. Perhaps the spirits she had summoned decades earlier had finally come to escort her home. Billie Holiday died at 3:10 a.m. with just 70 cents in her bank account and $750 taped to her leg, a desperate safeguard against a pauper's grave. Her eyes were said to be wide open, fixed on something beyond this world. To those who understand the cost of political sorcery, the truth was unmistakable. The final strange fruit snapped by the rope of prejudice was Lady Day herself. Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge. The beauty trapped in the mirror. Dorothy Dandridge was a pioneer blessed with a beauty so luminous it felt almost unreal, as if it belonged to another world beyond the silver screen. In 1953, while visiting Haiti's sacred Sot-Dio Falls, she was said to have stepped beneath the rushing midnight waters and whispered a desperate prayer to ancient spirits, begging for eternal beauty and Hollywood's favor. It was a mirror's bargain. Her image would remain flawless for the world to admire, but the cost would be her life itself. She traded pieces of her private soul for moments of light flickering across celluloid. The price was swift and cruel. Whispers followed her rise. Claims that her daughter Lynn's brain damage was the unspoken sacrifice demanded for Dorothy's ascent. Even fate seemed to warn her. In Las Vegas, a chilling omen surfaced when a hotel pool was reportedly drained moments after she entered the water, as if her spiritual current had run dry. By 1963, the fortune that once crowned her was gone, leaving her emptied and exposed, while her public image remained frozen in perfection. The final reckoning arrived on September 8, 1965. In the suffocating quiet of her Fountain Avenue apartment, Dorothy was found lifeless beside a large mirror, an overdose, and just $2 to her name. Financially ruined. Spiritually exhausted. Yet her face remained untouched by time, as radiant as it had been beneath the Haitian Falls. The mirror had kept its promise, but it became a gilded prison that would never release her soul. Dorothy Dandridge died a queen with nothing left but her reflection. She captured the world's gaze, but lost her own light deep within the glass. To those who remember her, she stands as a haunting reminder. Sometimes the very thing that makes you immortal is the same thing that makes life impossible to survive. Prince. The death sentence hidden inside a divine sigil. Most stars spend their lives trying to make their names eternal. Prince chose to erase his. On his 35th birthday, he didn't merely defy a record contract. He severed his bond with spoken identity itself. He abandoned his birth name and replaced it with an unpronounceable glyph, an act less like rebellion and more like ritual execution. By surrendering language, he stepped outside the shelter of human naming and into the reach of the nameless shadows. This act of identity arson did not go unnoticed. The Deep Roots Registry, an obscure inner circle of hoodoo scholars, documented the moment. Their sealed cipher warned that a birth name is the soul's final harbor. Strip it away, and the spirit drifts unmoored. By embracing the love symbol, Prince wasn't just fighting the industry, He was constructing an altar to himself. The registry observed his transformation from man to icon, a beacon that invited higher plane entities to feed on his life force as tribute. Paisley Park soon became a violet-lit cage. Insiders whispered that the vault held soul shards, thousands of unreleased songs, each a fragment of spirit torn loose and hidden away. This hoarding hollowed him out, leaving a paranoid husk pacing lilac-scented halls, convinced the vents themselves were breathing with him. The debt was finally collected in an elevator, a liminal space where dimensions thinned to paper. Prince was found sitting perfectly upright, eyes wide, frozen as if interrupted mid-thought by a silent command he could not refuse. He died at 57, crushed beneath the weight of the symbol he believed defined his freedom. By abandoning his given name, Prince discarded his spiritual shield. And when you trade your name for a symbol, you no longer belong to the living world. You belong to the sigil, Nat King Cole. Nat King Cole, the Golden Smoke Covenant, and the Curse of Breath. Nat King Cole possessed a voice so smooth it could still a riot and soften stone. But in the ruthless climate of 1950s America, brilliance alone could not shatter the color line of national television. According to the Deep Roots Registry, Nat sought more than talent to survive, he sought protection. In a back room in Birmingham, a root doctor allegedly offered him a covenant, golden smoke, a voice so velvety it would hypnotize the airwaves, in exchange for the breath that sustained his life. The pact ignited on April 10, 1956, the night Nat was savagely attacked on stage in Alabama. The public saw a racial assault. The cipher, the registry's sealed records, marked it as the moment the curse was awakened. From that night forward, Nat began smoking 3 packs of cool cigarettes a day. He told friends it kept his voice warm and mellow. The registry knew better. Each inhale was ritual, each exhale payment. Ash for applause, smoke for immortality. The reckoning came in 1964. Doctors at St. John's Hospital were stunned by a cancer that moved like wildfire, devouring his lungs with a speed medicine could not explain. As he faded, night nurses whispered of something unsettling. Nat's breathing wasn't labored. It sounded like wind slipping through hollow, ancient trees. The room carried the scent of burning wood, though no flame was found. Nat King Cole died on February 15, 1965, at just 45 years old. When he tried to sing one final note to his wife, the velvet was gone, replaced by the dry rattle of dying embers. He didn't simply pass away. He burned himself into history, turning his chest into a torch for progress. He traded his air for our future, proving that a man who conquers the world with his breath must one day surrender it to the shadows that gave him his song. Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson, the bargain struck at a Mississippi crossroads. Once a failure, he slipped into the Delta night and returned as a legend, a guitar in his hands tuned to something cold and final. In 1930, he was a joke, mocked for fumbling strings and empty bravado. Then he disappeared. When he came back a year later, he played with a speed so inhuman that witnesses swore 3 hands were flying across the fretboard. According to Deep Roots Registry lore, his brilliance came at a price. At the moonless crossing of Highways 49 and 61, a tall, shadowed figure took Robert's guitar and tuned it to the pulse of the abyss. As the registry's private cipher warned, the boy vanished that night. In his place stood a man whose music burned like borrowed light stolen from deep darkness. The curse followed him into every session. In San Antonio, Robert played facing the corner, hiding fingers that moved with a skeletal, impossible grace. He lived on the run, never the same bed more than 2 nights, eyes always searching the dark for hounds he knew were gaining ground. On August 16, 1938, in Three Forks, the debt came due. Compelled by something unseen, Robert drank poisoned whiskey and spent 3 days wasting away in agony. In his final hours, he dropped to all fours, barking and howling like a stray, possessed, it seemed, by the hellhounds of his own songs. He died at 27, leaving 29 tracks and a blood-soaked legacy, proof that the darkness only gives you 3 hands so it can drag you into the night more easily. Phyllis Hyman. Phyllis Hyman, the song of a haunted sophisticate. She was a jazz goddess, 6 feet of regal elegance, crowned with a voice capable of soothing the deepest heartbreak. But in the high-stakes world of Manhattan's elite nightclubs, brilliance often breeds resentment. Phyllis ruled the spotlight, unaware that in the shadows, someone was carefully stitching her fate shut. Her unraveling was quietly chronicled by the Sanctuary of the Seven Sisters, a secret circle of Harlem root workers. Their records, known as the Shadow Journal, told a disturbing story. A jealous rival had ordered a shadow binding deep in the Georgia pines. The ritual tethered a parasitic presence to Phyllis's aura, a curse called the weight of the shadow. Applause turned hollow, sleep became warfare, and night terrors stalked her dreams. Doctors labeled it bipolar disorder, but the sanctuary recognized spiritual attachment. When the lights went down, Phyllis heard cruel whispers, an intruder in her mind that no medication could silence. On June 30, 1995, backstage at the Apollo Theater, staff froze as she screamed into empty space, "What more do you want? I've given you everything." Witnesses later swore the air turned ice cold, as if a suffocating silhouette had draped itself over her shoulders. Hours later, Phyllis was found dead in her apartment. Her suicide note spoke of her enemy's laughter, the final seal of the curse. At just 45, a heavenly voice was extinguished, chased into the darkness by a grudge that never let go. James Brown, the covenant of unceasing rhythm. James Brown is celebrated as the hardest-working man in show business, but that title wasn't earned by sweat alone. Legend says it was fueled by something far darker, a supernatural hunger that demanded constant motion. A funk titan who bargained for an immortal groove, James learned too late that eternity comes at a brutal cost. Rest is forbidden. The story begins in 1952, deep in the mist-choked swamps of South Carolina. Fresh out of prison and crushed by poverty, he was said to have sought a reclusive healer beneath hanging Spanish moss. What answered his plea granted him relentless rhythm, a raw, primal force destined for global domination. The price was simple and terrifying. As long as he moved, his soul was his own. The moment the rhythm stopped, the debt would be collected. Witnesses point to the legendary Cape Town performance as proof. To most, it was theatrical brilliance. To those who truly understood, it was biological warfare against death itself. Every collapse to his knees was a flirtation with the abyss. The cape draped over his shoulders wasn't costume. It was a ceremonial shroud, a brief pause to steal another breath of borrowed life. He wasn't performing for applause. He was performing to keep his heart beating. By the late 1980s, that energy curdled into paranoia. His infamous 1988 high-speed chase wasn't just a run from the law. It was an attempt to outrun unseen collectors lurking at the edge of his vision. The rhythm had become a cage, a merciless vibration that allowed no peace. On Christmas Day, 2006, the music finally stopped. In an Atlanta hospital, James reportedly screamed at the ceiling, "They're coming for me." He died on the holiest day of the year, his body too fragile for one last performance. Even in death, he found no rest. His remains were moved from tomb to tomb for years. A final omen that for the man who borrowed the rhythm of the abyss, not even the grave could grant silence. These legends shimmer between blinding brilliance and the terrible price of immortality. If stories like this call to you, like and subscribe to join us as guardians of these sacred legacies. Tell us which restless soul haunts you most, or whose darkness we should dare to uncover next.